It started innocently enough. I moved into the cabin that had been in my family for generations, hoping to find peace, escape from the hustle of city life, and connect with nature. The lake, once a serene escape for my family, now felt more like a battleground, a quiet war that I wasn't even aware I was entering. The first strange signs were subtle. I noticed cars from out of state using the path daily, parking and unloading beach equipment as if they owned the place. It wasn't until I started paying closer attention that the magnitude of the situation hit me. Mrs. Martinez, the neighbor next door, would always look around anxiously, her eyes darting when Peggy's name was mentioned. I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear I started feeling when I realized something wasn't right in this quiet neighborhood. As the days went on, I began documenting the vehicles using the path. The same cars came back week after week, people unloading equipment, staying for long periods, and leaving just as silently as they arrived. They weren't just visiting the lake, they were treating it like their own private getaway. At first, I thought it was all in my head, but the more I watched, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a few neighbors walking down a shared path, this was something deliberate. Something illegal. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to investigate. At first, I tried the simplest approach I could think of. I set up a security camera in what I thought was an obvious location, hoping to catch some evidence of what was going on. But my amateur detective instincts didn't get me far. For days, all I saw on the footage were trees swaying in the wind. The camera was misaligned, and my first attempt at gathering evidence was a complete failure. It was frustrating, but I kept pushing. I dove into research, hoping that the internet could guide me through property laws and help me figure out how to protect what was rightfully mine. But instead of answers, I was overwhelmed by legal jargon I couldn't make sense of, easements, adverse possession, and terms that might as well have been in another language. The more I researched, the more confused I became. I turned to Mrs. Martinez, hoping to gather some insights from her. She had lived next door for years, and surely she would know something about the neighborhood's history and the access rights to the lake. But when I approached her, I could see the panic in her face. She looked like she was on the verge of running away. My questions made her nervous, and in the end, she practically slammed the door in my face. I couldn't understand why she was acting so frightened, but her reaction only deepened my suspicions. I knew I was onto something, but what exactly that something was, I still didn't know. Technology wasn't on my side either. The phone I'd been using to document the situation died at the worst possible moment, just when I was about to record something important. My backup camera's memory card corrupted, erasing 2 days of footage that could have been crucial. Every step I took felt like a failure. But there was one thing I had learned: persistence. And I wasn't going to give up. I had never imagined that one day I would be facing the kind of deception I was about to uncover. After the failures of my initial attempts, I started taking a more systematic approach. I repositioned the security camera, spending hours trying to find the perfect angle, one that wouldn't miss any crucial detail. I was learning, albeit the hard way. Slowly, I became better at capturing the activity on the path, but it still felt like I was chasing shadows. Then, everything changed in a single moment. It was pure luck, a stroke of fate that turned the tide in my favor. As I reviewed the footage, my eyes locked onto something I hadn't noticed before. Behind some bushes, almost hidden from sight, was a sign. At first, I thought it was just another piece of junk someone had left behind, but then I saw the words that made my blood run cold. Premium lake access $45 per day. Cash or electronic payment accepted. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was a business. Someone was charging people money to use my lakefront, and they had the audacity to advertise it like it was a legitimate service. The sign detailed everything: where to park, where to walk, the rules for maximum stays, and even cleaning instructions. This wasn't just a couple of confused neighbors. This was an organized operation, and Peggy was at the heart of it. My heart pounded as I realized the enormity of what I had just discovered. This wasn't some simple boundary dispute or misunderstanding about property rights. This was fraud on a scale I never could have imagined. Peggy wasn't just managing access, she was running an illegal business using my property as the product. I felt a surge of anger mixed with disbelief. How could she do this? And why? What was her endgame? But even as the full extent of the situation began to sink in, another realization came crashing down on me. Peggy wasn't some rogue neighbor acting out of ignorance. No, she was running this operation with professional precision. The laminated sign, the pricing tiers, the rules, it was all part of a business model, one that had been running for months, if not longer. I thought about the cars with out-of-state plates. The weekend visitors. The groups unloading equipment. It all made sense now. They weren't just tourists enjoying the lake, they were paying customers, part of a scam that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. I knew I had to act, but I wasn't sure how. Confronting Peggy directly seemed like the obvious step, but something about the way Mrs. Martinez reacted when I mentioned her name made me hesitate. It was clear that Peggy had some kind of influence over the neighborhood. Mrs. Martinez's fear, her rushed warnings, echoed in my mind. Was I really ready to face off with someone who had been running this operation for so long, someone who had clearly built a network of loyal followers? And then there was the question of the law. I wasn't even sure if I had any legal grounds to stand on. Could I prove this was my land? Could I prove she had no right to be charging people for access? The legal terms I had encountered were still a blur in my mind, and I wasn't even sure where to start. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't let this go. Not now that I had uncovered the truth. I started to make a plan, unsure of where to turn next. There had to be a way to expose Peggy and put an end to her illegal business, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my journey wasn't going to be easy. This was just the beginning, and it felt like the stakes were higher than ever. There's a sense of disbelief, anger, and confusion. The hook here is the discovery of the sign and the realization that Peggy has been running a scam. The protagonist now faces an emotional conflict, whether to confront Peggy directly or to gather more evidence first. Once I had confirmed what I had already suspected, this was no random mistake, no misunderstanding between neighbors, everything about my approach shifted. My mind was racing, but my actions were deliberate. I knew that I had to gather evidence, real evidence that could stand up in court, in front of law enforcement. The problem was, my first attempts at collecting evidence had failed spectacularly. The camera angles had been wrong, the footage had been useless, and my own legal understanding was still murky. I had to do this carefully, methodically, or I could risk losing everything. I became obsessed with getting the evidence right. I pored over online tutorials about camera placement, studying surveillance techniques like I was preparing for a professional job. Every time I repositioned a camera, I did it with purpose, adjusting angles, adjusting timing, thinking of every possible variable that might affect the footage. No more tree branches. No more empty frames. This had to work, and I knew I couldn't afford to make another mistake. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the growing sense that Peggy was watching me, that she was somehow aware of my investigation. It wasn't just her business I was dealing with anymore, it was her network, her influence, her web of manipulation. I started noticing things. Casual conversations with neighbors that quickly turned awkward. Strange glances when I passed by. And then, just as I was starting to feel like I was getting closer to a breakthrough, it happened. It wasn't a mistake or an accident. It was a calculated attack. The violation notices started coming in. They were petty, minor things, my mailbox being too close to the street, my grass growing too high, my outdoor furniture not fitting neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, a string of annoyances that would pass. But when the fines arrived, I realized something darker was at play. These weren't just random complaints, they were attacks, designed to break me down mentally, emotionally, and financially. Peggy, or someone in her circle, was systematically targeting me, trying to wear me down so I would back off. She wanted me to feel like an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the community. The violation notices were just the beginning. The social media campaign was more insidious. Peggy, under the guise of concern for the neighborhood, had started posting on the community groups, framing me as the problem. New lakefront resident disrupting peaceful neighborhood life, she wrote, painting a picture of a troublemaker who didn't respect long-established traditions. The words were carefully chosen, designed to make me seem unreasonable, a threat to everything the neighborhood had built. It wasn't long before the neighbors who had once been friendly turned cold. People stopped waving. Conversations became stiff, and eyes that had once been warm now avoided mine. Mrs. Martinez, who had been my only ally, now looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. I could see it in her eyes, she was scared of Peggy. She had already been manipulated by her, and now, she was caught in the same web of fear and control that I was trying to escape. The more I observed, the more it became clear, Peggy wasn't just a manipulative neighbor. She was a master of psychological warfare, and she knew exactly how to control a community. She had built a narrative that everyone could believe, that I was the outsider, the interloper, and that Peggy was the protector of the neighborhood's harmony. The fact that she had so many people believing this lie was terrifying. But as I dug deeper, something became painfully clear. I wasn't just dealing with a few petty neighborhood disputes. This was a well-oiled machine. Different people started walking the path daily, all claiming they had permission from the association president to use the lakefront. When I tried to ask questions, they would immediately call Peggy, and within minutes, she would show up, taking control of the situation as if she was the rightful authority figure. She wasn't just running a business, she was running an entire operation, one that was designed to keep anyone from challenging her. She was using fear and intimidation to maintain control. And that's when I decided. Enough was enough. I couldn't just keep watching from the sidelines. I had to act, but I had to be smart about it. I couldn't let Peggy know what I was doing. I had to be patient, wait for her to make a mistake. I knew she would. People like Peggy always do. But when that mistake came, I would be ready to expose her. It was only a matter of time before I got what I needed, what I'd been waiting for. They begin to feel the pressure of Peggy's manipulation and the toll it takes on their personal life. The frustration of being targeted by these petty violations and social media attacks makes the protagonist feel isolated and helpless. But it also strengthens their resolve, making the eventual discovery of Peggy's mistake all the more powerful. I wasn't prepared for the moment when everything would finally come to light. It happened one Saturday morning, under the strangest of circumstances. After weeks of setting up cameras, researching property laws, and living under the constant stress of Peggy's increasing pressure, I was beginning to feel like I was chasing something that might never come to fruition. But the mistake, her mistake, was coming. I knew it would come eventually. No one, no matter how calculated, can keep up a lie forever. That morning, I was out by the cabin when I saw the familiar stream of cars pulling up. This time, though, it wasn't a couple of people coming for a quiet day at the lake. No, this was something bigger. A family reunion, or at least that's what it looked like. 12 people got out of multiple vehicles, unloading catering equipment, tables, chairs, and a generator for music. It wasn't just a small group of people showing up for a day at the lake. These people were here to spend the entire day, to celebrate, to make a party out of something that should have been private. They were paying customers, just like the others who had come before them. I approached them carefully, my phone in hand, recording as I walked. My heart was racing, knowing this could be the moment that changed everything. I kept my voice calm, trying to sound as reasonable as I could, but the anger bubbling under the surface was almost impossible to contain. "Excuse me, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. "This is actually private property," I said, forcing myself to remain composed. The reaction was immediate. "What are you talking about?" demanded the woman in charge, a middle-aged woman in a t-shirt that read "Family Reunion Coordinator." "We paid Margaret $55 each for community lake access. She's the neighborhood association president." I blinked, my mind racing. Margaret. The name hit me like a punch in the gut. She wasn't just some well-meaning neighbor. She was running this operation like a business, taking money from people who believed they were paying for legitimate access to community property. The woman waved a printed email confirmation in front of my face, and my blood ran cold. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. The family members joined in, telling me about the reservation they had made months ago, about the guarantee of exclusive access, and the promise of a serene, private experience. They even mentioned how Peggy had told them it was handicap accessible, something they needed because of elderly family members. They pulled out their phones, showing me the electronic payment confirmations, $660 in total for the group. I was stunned, momentarily at a loss for words. How had Peggy pulled this off? How had she convinced people to pay for something they had no right to charge for? As the group leader grew more agitated, I knew this wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. These people had been deceived. They had been lied to, and their money had been taken under false pretenses. The situation escalated quickly. The family members became upset, and they started calling Peggy, demanding an explanation. Within minutes, she arrived, just as she always did, right on cue, like some kind of neighborhood savior. She immediately took control of the situation, positioning herself between me and the family members, her presence turning the entire scenario on its head. "Alex, this is completely unacceptable," she said, her voice firm, as if she were the authority. "You're harassing paying community members." She stood tall, almost regal in her confidence, her hand outstretched toward the family, as though she were protecting them from the evil outsider. "These people have legal rights to community lake access. Your interference is a violation of multiple association bylaws." I stood there, trying to keep my composure, knowing that this was exactly what I had been waiting for. Peggy was confident, too confident. She knew the game she was playing, and she had convinced others to believe her too. But now, I had her. I had the evidence. The family members, still clutching their phones and reservations, didn't seem to know what to do. They were confused, caught between their trust in Peggy and the growing sense that something wasn't right. As Peggy spoke, I kept my phone recording. I knew this was the moment that could change everything. I didn't want to confront her directly, there was too much at stake. But I could expose her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of her carefully crafted narrative. Peggy's performance was flawless. She acted like she had the entire neighborhood behind her, that she was simply doing what was best for the community. But the more she spoke, the more I realized just how much she had manipulated everyone around her. She wasn't just running a scam, she was building an empire of lies. She was preparing for the next step in her plan, though. It was only when she made her final move that I realized the full scope of what she had been doing. Peggy dialed 911. "Officer, I need immediate assistance," she said, her voice perfectly rehearsed. "This resident is blocking legal community access and harassing paying members." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was calling the police on me, trying to turn the situation completely around, portraying me as the problem, as the one disrupting the peace. It wasn't just a bluff anymore. She was pulling every string she could to protect her empire of deception. I didn't know how this would end. Would the police believe her? Would they side with me, the newcomer, the one who had the evidence to prove she was running a fraudulent operation? The thought of the police showing up, not knowing the full story, made my stomach turn. Peggy had orchestrated this whole situation, and now, she was trying to twist it into her favor. But I had one thing she didn't: truth. And that truth was slowly but surely coming to the surface. The discovery that Peggy has manipulated not only the protagonist but also a group of paying customers is a turning point in the story. The protagonist now has the evidence, but Peggy's response is one of calculated deflection, creating further complications. The moment of truth is near, but it's still unclear who will come out on top. I had spent weeks, no, months, preparing for this moment. Every camera angle, every piece of research, every interaction with the neighbors, it had all led to this. But even as the police arrived, I wasn't sure what would happen next. Would they side with the confident, authoritative Peggy, or would they see through the facade she had so carefully crafted? I couldn't afford to hesitate, not now. I had the evidence, and this was my chance to finally expose her lies. As Officer Reynolds and his partner approached, I felt a chill run through me. He wasn't just any officer. He had the demeanor of someone who had seen it all, someone who had dealt with countless disputes, many far more complicated than a neighborhood quarrel. And from the moment he walked up, I could tell he wasn't buying Peggy's performance. She, on the other hand, was ready to play her role to perfection. "Officer, thank you for responding so quickly," Peggy said, her voice smooth and practiced. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, president of the Lakeview Community Association. This resident," she gestured toward me, "is illegally blocking established community lake access while harassing paying members." Her words hung in the air, and I could see the tension building. She was positioning herself as the rightful authority, the community protector, while I stood there, holding my breath, praying that Officer Reynolds would see through the illusion. But this wasn't just about words, it was about facts. I had the facts, and I knew I had to present them clearly, without emotion, without panic. "Ma'am, you mentioned that these are paying members," Officer Reynolds said, his voice calm but with a sharp edge. "Can you explain what you mean by paying?" Peggy hesitated for a moment. "They contribute to community maintenance costs," she replied, but there was a noticeable crack in her confidence. "It's all managed properly through official association procedures." I watched as the officer pressed on, his tone unwavering. "And you have documentation of your association authority and these fee collection procedures?" That was when I saw it, the first real crack in Peggy's perfect act. She stammered, her usual smooth delivery faltering for just a second. "Of course, everything's official," she said, her eyes darting to the group of family members who had gathered with their reservation confirmations in hand. "I've been president for 4 years. The documentation is at my home office." Officer Reynolds didn't miss a beat. "I understand this feels urgent, but I'll need to see those documents before I can take any action regarding property disputes or authority claims." It was at that moment that Peggy's arrogance began to show. She had assumed she could talk her way out of this. She had been doing it for so long that she thought no one would question her authority. But now, Officer Reynolds wasn't just taking her at her word. He was asking the right questions, the questions that would tear apart the whole house of cards she had built. I stepped forward, my voice steady. "Officer, I have documentation of my property ownership here," I said, handing over the deed, survey map, and legal descriptions of my land. "This land is mine, and there are no easements or public access rights attached to it." I watched as the officer examined the documents, his eyes scanning over the papers carefully. Then, I handed him my phone, where I had been recording Peggy's conversation with the family. "I also have recordings of Peggy discussing fees and reservations for access to my lakefront," I said, my voice firm. "She's been charging people for something she has no right to sell." The family members stepped forward, adding their voices to the growing pile of evidence. They had paid Peggy, believing she was the legitimate authority figure, the elected association president. They had paid for access to a private lakefront, something they believed was a public resource. Their testimony, combined with the recordings, was damning. "We each paid her $55, the group leader said, holding up her printed confirmation email. "She guaranteed us access to the lake. We have electronic payment receipts. She said she was the association president. The weight of the truth hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Peggy, once so confident, now stood there, trapped in her own lies. The officer's next question sealed her fate. "Ma'am," Officer Reynolds said, "you mentioned that you've been the association president for 4 years. Can you provide any official documentation of that appointment?" Peggy's face drained of color. "Of course, I can. The documents are at my office," she repeated, but there was no conviction in her voice this time. "I'm afraid we'll need to verify that through official channels," the officer said, his calm tone belying the seriousness of the situation. "We need to ensure everything checks out before we proceed." A tense silence fell over the group as Officer Reynolds radioed for confirmation from the City Records Department. I watched as Peggy's carefully constructed world started to crumble. Minutes later, the radio crackled, and Officer Reynolds' face grew more serious. He glanced at Peggy, then at me, and delivered the news that no one could have predicted. "There's no record of Margaret Thornfield as the current association president," the officer said. "The last recorded president is James Thompson, who was elected 2 years ago. He is still listed as the active president." The silence that followed was deafening. Peggy's face contorted with disbelief. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won the election. I'm the president." Officer Reynolds remained unmoved. "Ma'am, if you were elected, we should have records of that election. And as far as the city's concerned, James Thompson is still the president. You'll need to provide proper documentation to support your claims." The walls were closing in on her. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that her empire of lies was finally coming to an end. She tried to protest, to deny, but her story was falling apart with every passing second. As the officer continued his investigation, Peggy's confidence started to disintegrate. Her voice grew louder, more desperate. "There must be an error," she stammered. "I've been president for 2 years. The records must be wrong. You have to believe me." But nothing could save her now. The truth was out. Peggy was no longer the president, and she had no right to collect fees for access to my land. Her entire operation had been a lie, a carefully orchestrated fraud that had preyed on unsuspecting residents for months, maybe even years. I had won. But as the officer continued to question Peggy, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There was still so much more to uncover, and Peggy wouldn't go down quietly. The emotional payoff is huge, as Peggy's facade begins to crumble in front of the law. The legal showdown is intense, and the protagonist's persistence finally starts to pay off. But even though the truth is revealed, there's a sense that Peggy's downfall is far from over. It felt surreal as Officer Reynolds began his final round of questioning. The weight of everything that had happened, the sleepless nights, the endless hours of surveillance, the pain of isolation as the neighborhood turned its back on me, was suddenly lifting. It wasn't just the confirmation that Peggy had been running a fraudulent business on my property, it was the realization that justice was finally being served. But that didn't mean Peggy was done fighting. As she stood there, surrounded by the mounting evidence, I could see the last shreds of her control slipping away. Her initial confidence, her ability to manipulate, was gone. Now, there was only desperation in her eyes, a desperate scramble to salvage whatever she could of the empire she had built on lies. She had come so far with her deceit, thinking she could keep up the facade forever. But in that moment, Peggy's world came crashing down. The officer's voice was steady as he spoke, laying out the charges against her. "Margaret Thornfield, you are under investigation for multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, document forgery, elder abuse, and extortion. Your actions have caused harm to this community, and we have sufficient evidence to press criminal charges." Her face paled as the officer continued, the words becoming a blur of reality she could no longer deny. She had been caught. The elaborate house of cards she had spent months, maybe even years, building was collapsing, piece by piece. It wasn't just about the money she had stolen from unsuspecting families, it was the lives she had manipulated and shattered along the way. Peggy's cruelty wasn't just confined to my property, it had affected so many others in the neighborhood, people who had trusted her, people who had believed in her fabricated version of reality. But the darkest part of all wasn't just her fraudulent business practices. It was the systematic targeting of vulnerable residents, elderly people, immigrants, families with disabilities. Peggy had preyed on those who were least able to fight back, using their fears, their hopes, and their lack of knowledge to extract money for something that never should have been for sale. The more I uncovered, the more it became clear that Peggy wasn't just a petty scam artist. She was a predator, one who had exploited the most vulnerable members of the community for her own gain. And it wasn't just the victims I had been able to document. As word spread about the investigation, more and more people began to come forward with their stories. The elderly couple who had been charged for non-existent maintenance fees. The family who had been fined for a wheelchair ramp that didn't meet Peggy's made-up standards. The young immigrant family who had been charged community integration fees just for moving into the neighborhood. Every person had a story of how Peggy had taken advantage of them, how she had convinced them to pay for something that wasn't real. The final blow came when the financial investigation revealed the full extent of Peggy's operation. Over the course of 2 years, she had collected more than $8,000 in illegal fees, all while masquerading as a legitimate community leader. And that wasn't even the worst of it. The forged documents, the fake election minutes, the unauthorized charges, each new piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of just how deep her lies went. The criminal charges were piling up, and they were far more serious than I had ever anticipated. But it didn't end there. As the investigation continued, one shocking detail emerged after another. Peggy had targeted people with health problems, new immigrants unfamiliar with the area, and people who couldn't afford to fight back. She had manipulated and bullied her way through the neighborhood, controlling people with fear and lies. And the worst part? She knew exactly what she was doing. The authorities weren't the only ones who had to take action. The neighborhood, once divided by Peggy's manipulation, was now coming together. Residents who had been too afraid to speak up began to realize the full extent of what Peggy had done. Mrs. Martinez, who had been too afraid to help at first, became the first to publicly speak out, sharing how Peggy had forced her husband to sign false property agreements in his final days. Others followed her lead, standing up and sharing their stories of how Peggy had taken advantage of them, one by one. By the time Peggy was arrested, the entire community had turned against her. People who had once trusted her were now completely disillusioned. The illusion of community leadership that Peggy had created was shattered. The neighborhood rallied together, and in the aftermath of her arrest, things began to change. The legitimate association president, James Thompson, returned from his medical leave and took control once again. Transparency became the new norm. Financial records were made public, and every resident was assured that no one would ever be taken advantage of again. New rules were put in place to protect the most vulnerable members of the community, ensuring that something like this could never happen again. There were audits, reviews, and safeguards. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt safe. As for Peggy, her fall from grace was swift. She pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges, including grand theft, identity theft, and elder abuse. She was sentenced to probation, community service, and ordered to pay restitution to the victims she had wronged. But even as she was held accountable, I couldn't help but wonder, how had it come to this? How had one person, one woman, managed to deceive so many, to control a community for so long, without anyone questioning her authority? The emotional toll of this whole ordeal was immense. For months, I had felt like an outsider, watching from the sidelines as Peggy manipulated everyone around me. But now, it was over. Justice had been served. People who had been living in fear, wondering whether they were next on Peggy's list, could finally breathe again. It wasn't just about the money, it was about restoring dignity, trust, and a sense of safety. I stood on the cabin deck at sunset, looking out over the lake. The water was calm, peaceful once again. The ripples caused by Peggy's deceit were gone, and the neighborhood had started to heal. Mrs. Martinez was outside tending her garden, no longer looking over her shoulder, no longer living in fear. The community was whole again, and my family's cabin, my inheritance, had returned to being what it was always meant to be, a peaceful retreat. The journey had been long, and the emotional cost had been high. But as I watched the sunset and listened to the birds, I knew that sometimes, the greatest victory isn't just exposing the truth, it's finding peace after the storm.